The collapse of the Soviet Union. Our learning target today is for you to be able to describe the role President Ronald Reagan played in the collapse of the Soviet Union. To recap, the citizens in these communist countries were restless. They did not have any personal freedoms. They did not have free speech or freedom of religion. They could only read and listen to what the government approved. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev decided to make some changes for the better. He allowed citizens to have freedom of speech. And now that citizens could speak freely, they demanded freedom for their countries and separation from communist Soviet control. People in countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary called for free elections. And in East Germany, something incredible happened. When large protests began happening in the streets, the government opened the border between East and West Berlin. This would eventually lead to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and celebrations throughout Germany as citizens were finally able to travel freely to the West. People celebrated by climbing on the Berlin Wall and tearing it down. This would lead to the separation of the Soviet Union. It was divided into 15 independent republics by the end of 1992. The rebellions and protests across the Soviet Union led to its collapse. President Ronald Reagan was one of the key figures in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Reagan was elected President of the United States in 1981. He strongly disagreed with the Soviets and communism, and he wanted to stop the spread of communism around the world. President Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and he vowed to make them give more freedoms to their citizens. No more missiles. Reagan tried to convince the Soviets to get rid of some of their nuclear missiles by putting pressure on them. He also wanted the U.S. to research satellites that could shoot down Soviet missiles from space using ray beams. President Reagan believed that having a thriving economy, better technology than the Soviet Union, and a powerful military would help to defeat the communist superpower and reverse the control that the Soviet Union seemed to have over Eastern Europe. He believed in increasing the budget for the military and for nuclear warfare by $117 billion. And he created the Star Wars project. This type of technology seems so far in the future that Americans called the idea Star Wars. The project's goal was to use lasers armed with nuclear warheads to shoot down Soviet missiles from space. The Soviets began to feel pressure from President Reagan. This caused them to spend more and more money on their military, but then they spent less money on the needs of their citizens. During this time, the Soviet economy was not doing well, and the government could not really afford more military spending. Living conditions for Soviet citizens got much worse. This made them angry, and they started to rebel. In a very famous speech in 1987, President Ronald Reagan spoke in West Berlin. He called for Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the wall. This is a line that is still famous to this day. President Reagan very seriously and very strongly told Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Standing up for freedom. President Ronald Reagan's actions definitely influenced the breakup of the Soviet Union. And finally, on January 31st, 1990, the first McDonald's opened in Russia. Hundreds of people stood in line just for a chance to experience Western culture. People in communist nations were so interested in what life was like in America. So the idea of having their own McDonald's was a very, very big deal to them. This opening of McDonald's was seen as a major sign of the end of the Cold War. And that's it for today's lesson. If you get your social studies workbook, we will get ready to check your understanding. Reagan and the Soviets. U.S. President Ronald Reagan was one of the key figures in the collapse of the Soviet Union. When Reagan came into office in 1981, he was a fierce critic of the Soviets. He wanted to stop communism around the world. Reagan tried to persuade the Soviets to reduce the number of their nuclear missiles. He used harsh words like evil empire about the Soviet Union publicly. Reagan also wanted the United States to spend lots of money researching satellites that could shoot down Soviet missiles from space using ray beams. Such technology seemed so far in the future that Americans called his idea Star Wars, but the Soviet leaders found Reagan's proposal very threatening. The Soviets responded to Reagan's pressure by spending even more money on their military and less on the needs of their citizens. At that time, the Soviet economy was doing well, and the government really could not afford more military spending. Living conditions for average citizens got worse, which made them more willing to demand change from the government. President Reagan also encouraged communist countries in Eastern Europe to break away from the Soviet Union. In a 1987 speech in West Berlin, he called on Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. Reagan's actions and policies encouraged the collapse of the Soviet Union. Later, Reagan's attitude toward the Soviets changed. In the late 1980s, his administration negotiated several treaties with the Soviet Union to abolish various kinds of nuclear missiles. In 1988, Reagan gave a speech in Moscow and said the term evil empire was no longer correct. On the very bottom, you should see a cause and effect chart. Determine the effects that were caused by Reagan and the Soviets. Cause number 1. President Reagan wanted to shoot down Soviet missiles, so he proposed the Star Wars project. So you would write that in this box. Number 2. This made Soviet leaders nervous, so we go up top. The Soviets responded to Reagan's pressure by spending even more money on their military. So they spent even more money on their military and less on the needs of their citizens. And you would write that right there in that box with the pink dot. Number 3, this made the Soviet people angry, so if we go back to our text, this made the Soviets angry, so they demanded change from their government. And you would write that in the last box. There you go. Your lesson is done for today. Have a great one.